everybody. Thank you for sparing the time. We're here this afternoon to talk about using our learning environment in a really targeted way to support skill development. And that will be to support skill development for all our young children. But of course, we're going to have a particular focus for those children who've got skill gaps. And most of you will realise that this is the second session that we're running through Newcastle Local Authority and the work we're doing with the North of Tyne Combined Authority. So if you weren't at the first session, Beth will be able to supply you with the link for that. And in a bit, we'll be having a third session where we'll be looking more at that other layer of practice, which is our focused activities that we do with all children, or particularly with some children, to move their skill development on. Anyway, let's think about what we're going to talk about in terms of the learning environment. So in the first session, let's link this together. In the first session, we looked particularly at our interactions with children and how we could use simple strategies and principles to support our interactions in order to support skill development and to support gap closing with children who had got skill gaps. But we've also got to think about our learning environment as well, because really we've got this kind of triad of things that we need to consider. We've got the child at the top, obviously. Then we've got our interactions. But of course, our learning environment creates opportunities for us to have certain types of interactions and add certain vocabulary and to develop certain skills. So although we did look purely at interaction strategies last time, we can't look at interactions without also considering this targeted use of the learning environment. For me, the learning environment creates opportunities. It creates opportunities for me to add certain language, add certain vocabulary, model certain sentence structures, and to develop certain skills. And that's why our learning environment is so crucial. But our learning environment without those quality interactions can only get us so far. We're also going to look at our learning environment this afternoon in order to support play, and we're going to consider why we might want to look at and think about play a little bit more deeply with certain children with skill gaps. And we're also, throughout all of this, going to be talking about progression for all young children, but we're going to be talking about specific ways we can use our learning environment in a targeted way to build certain skills. So we'll be linking it all of the time to Launchpad and also linking certain ways of using our learning environment that are particularly good for closing certain skill gaps. So what we see is we see the skills framework in Launchpad as a way of understanding child development. It breaks down all the different skills into different columns, and then within those columns we've got that incremental progression, and we can use that to really look at our children's development in more detail, to identify those gaps, but also to think about, well, what can children do and what they need to do next. And then this session is more about how can we use these learning environment strategies and these learning environmental principles to lift children up that skills framework. So the delivery of Launchpad is our targeted good practice. But as we use these strategies and as we use these principles, what we're doing is we're moving children up that skills framework through our targeted practice. So to begin with, we're going to think about what we would call in early years our core skills, and the core skills that we're going to consider initially will be the skills around play and also the skills around PSED and peer interaction. So when we're thinking about play on Launchpad, we go to that symbolic skill strand. So if we look at the Launchpad skills framework, we've got the red on the left, which is auditory, and it takes us all the way across to the edge of the light blue, which ends in speech. all of that is to do with the mechanics of speech and language. And then just to the right of speech, we've got symbolic skills. And this is where language and play and our learning environment and how children utilize our learning environment kind of comes together. And what we find is that children with delayed language development, particularly if it's affecting their processing of language, their listening and their receptive language skills, and the development of their vocabulary, we will often find that children with delayed language skills also present with delayed symbolic skills. So we will have gaps in this skill strand as well, and that certain children with disordered language development, and some of those children may go on to get a diagnosis of autistic spectrum disorder, or it may be just that their language skill profile is a little bit quirky, a little bit unusual, will possibly also have specific symbolic gaps in the symbolic skill strand. So we can therefore use looking at children's play as a way of identifying gaps in children, identifying children that we need to look at more closely. But also, what's the most important thing is that we can use play as a vehicle for intervention and for gap closing. And that is why the early years is just so fundamentally important, and that we have to see embedding interventions and closing skill gaps across all of our practice. And one of the biggest vehicles, like we say, is our interactions, but also children's play. So when we're thinking about play and lifting children's skills through that Launchpad skills framework, up that skill strand, for most of our children, it's about creating that learning environment and ensuring that we've got a wide range of different opportunities, different types of play, different areas, and we make those available to children. And what we find is when children have got stronger developmental skills, when they've already got a fairly firm base of early play development in place, that when we put them in this learning environment, they will access a wide range of areas. They'll play in different ways. Okay, yes, they still might have favourites and be more interested in some things than others, but we will see lots of different play, and we will see progress with the play because of these opportunities that we have made available. But there will also be the need to unpick children who are not meeting age-related expectations with play and with language, where we might need to look at their play in a little bit more detail, look at what they can do, look at what they're finding tricky. We might need to go back and to have a clear sense of next steps for children. And hopefully the Launchpad Skills Framework will help you to look at what you're doing with everybody, to think about, are we making these wide range of opportunities for all of this type of play and this progression available, but also particularly how can we use it to look at a child's play who might not be accessing everything in the way that we want them to. So I suppose when you're thinking about who to look at and who to support in more detail, it's where is just making your learning environment and those opportunities available, where is that enough, and who actually needs more support? And certainly when I was kind of working more full-time as a practitioner, and before that, the children that I used to think about a lot as a speech and language therapist, were often children who we could classify with certain words, certain terminology. So that often if we look at our disruptive children, our children who may exhibit concerns about or make us concerned about behaviour, or children who just seem to get everything out, or for want of a better phrase, wreck the learning environment a little bit. That often if we look at those children and say, does that child actually know how to play? Do they do this? Do they get everything out? Or do they kind of knock things over and move things because actually they don't know what else to do? And I think this is sometimes a question that we need to ask ourselves more. There will also be some children that we classify as shy or passive or lacking in confidence. And again, what we sometimes find is that that is correct, that that child is able to do all of these different things, but it is lacking in confidence. But very often, what we often find is that children where we're thinking it's an issue with confidence, actually what we're seeing is uncertainty because the child's not quite sure what to do. And that might be uncertainty around play, how to use resources, what to do with them, where to go. And also often children who appear to be shy and passive and lacking in confidence often might have language processing, receptive language gaps. So they're uncertain because they're unsure what's going on and what people are saying and asking them to do. Other children that you might want to unpick a little bit more are, this is a personal term of mine, it's not a professional term, but children who I used to call floaters, where they are moving around the environment, but they're not particularly involved and engrossed in certain types of play and need an adult to guide them and direct them. And again, we have to kind of look a little bit at play and language with children like that. Why are they needing that higher level of support, and how can we make that support a bit more specific? Children that we would possibly rarely consider would be children who tend to gravitate to but follow another child's lead all the time. Why do they let another child make all the decisions and choose where to go and what to go? Is that because they like it that way? They could do it themselves, but they prefer to do it that way. Or are they using that other child as a support because without that other child, they wouldn't know what to do? And the biggest group of children, I would say that again, I used to pick up time and time again as a speech and language therapist out in sessions, would be those children with what I would call a limited play repertoire. You know, those children who go to the same thing and do the same thing every day, or maybe just to one or two different areas. They're not accessing a wide area of the learning environment. They're not exhibiting lots of different types of play. And again, in the early years world, it's really easy to say that that's because that's what they're interested in. They play with the trains every day because that's what they're interested in. Of course, they're interested in the trains because they feel safe with the trains and they know what to do with the trains. But what I shouldn't do is see the fact that that child never goes to the home corner or never goes to the Play-Doh as an issue of interest when actually they don't go there because of a skill gap, and they don't go there because they don't know what to do when they got there. And as a practitioner who is supporting skill development and trying to close gaps, I've got to identify those children and think, right, I need to put some support in and I need to be doing something about that. So what we need to be doing very much, and this is just general practice, this will be things that you're doing already, is to really see the adult role in child-initiated learning as a role where, of course, we add language and of course we use those interaction strategies that we talked about last time. But I support and I model play, and I model play at the child's level, but also create opportunities to try them to lift them to their next steps. And to be aware that for some children, I might actually have to teach them how to play, particularly children who have got more delayed development, and very much so for children who have got more disordered developmental profiles. And when I say teach play, I don't mean that you make it a formal activity at all. This is in the moment. This is within the learning environment. But I suppose what I'm trying to say is we have almost that expectation that children can play and that then we move their play on. But for some children, particularly with things like pretend play and creative play, which are particularly problematic for children with language skill gaps, we've got this idea of, I've actually got to show you how to do this. I've got to actually teach you what play is all about. And that's a really important role that the adult has for those children. And that is a really important part of what you should be seeing as your interventions. And also, until we get that play and those interactions going, it's going to be very difficult for you to kind of move other skills on or target more specific language skills. The play and the interactions are at the bedrock of everything. If you are going to have to really expand a child's play repertoire to teach them how to access more than a limited part of your provision, or if you notice that a child doesn't really ever go to areas that require pretending, or never particularly goes to areas that require a level of creativity, then you might be wanting, right, okay, well, we've got to expand that out, not just expand the places that they go, but expand the types of play and the way that that child plays. But rather than trying to kind of work on everything at once, certainly if it were me, I would be kind of saying, right, okay, we're going to focus on one area first, right? Okay, we're going to focus on Play-Doh, for example, because the child very rarely goes there. So rather than trying to stretch them out and go to lots of different new areas all at once, keep taking the child back again and again to that kind of one area of the provision that they don't know how to use and that they don't know how to access, and just not for very long, but just have that almost that shot of intervention in that area where you're modeling to the child how to use and explore those resources in a really kind of simple way. But you would keep kind of going back to that one area. We talked about the importance of repetition in skill building in relation to building language last time. And I think this is the same thing. It's like more and more of the same is more useful than trying to do too much and too many different things, but not very often. And of course, when you feel that you've built skill and awareness in one area, it might be that you can then walk away and that child begins to access that area of the provision themselves. And then you might think, right, okay, we're going to branch out now and we're going to do the same type of thing, but we're going to show you how to use a different area. And of course, you will not need to be doing this with all children, but you might need to be doing it with certain children. And I'm sure you're all aware of who those children are. Another really simple way to use your learning environment to support interactions and play is to have a really strong focus on turn taking throughout your learning environment. And you will be working on turn taking already. But what I'm talking about is doing some really simple, targeted turn taking work. So if I build turn taking, and I'm going to talk about turn taking in a really kind of simple way here. Of course, on Launchpad, the progression of turn taking is detailed in conversation and group skills. So just to the right of symbolic skills, we've got pragmatics, and the first skill strand in pragmatics, also known as social communication, are those conversation and group skills. And the development of turn taking is plotted out throughout that skill strand on Launchpad. But if we work on turn taking, we also do other things as well. It's also one of our best ways of supporting children's auditory attention skills. It also supports peer interactions, and although, of course, speech, language and communication is highly correlated with communication and language in the EYFS, turn taking, play, pragmatics This is really kind of part of our core PSED skills. So again, if you're wanting to build peer interactions, if you're wanting to build moving children from solitary play towards parallel and then collaborative play, if you're wanting to generally boost levels of play, levels of sharing, levels of PSED, then having turn taking at the core of your practice can be a really good and strong way to go. And the good news is it's really quite simple to do that. That what we need to do is really just do a turn-taking audit of our learning environment. What is it that lends itself well to really simple turn-taking routines? And of course, you've got to look at your own learning environment, but I'll throw in a few examples so that you can kind of see the type of thing that I mean. So it might be, oh, well, we've got the wooden blocks, and do you know what? We could take it in turns to build a tower together. And for some children, that would be my turn, your turn, my turn, your turn, as they did one-to-one turn taking. And for other children, it could be that we do the same thing, but rather than just having one-to-one turn taking, there might be 2 or 3 children and me, so that we still build a collaborative tower, but this time we have a very small groups where we build a group tower together. Other things might be, well, we've got the slide outside, or okay, well, we've got a water wheel in the water tray. We could take it in turns to pour water through. I used to have some kind of cut off bits of drain pipe outside, which we used to roll things down. Right, okay, you could take turns with that. We've got a car with a garage where we could take turns to roll cars down the ramp. So none of these resources are rocket science. They're all things that you will have, or you will have other things that I haven't mentioned, that can easily be used to do this. And also you might get specific resources to do this. Like I often used to put into my learning environment specifically a click clack track. So one of those wooden ramps where you get little wooden cars, things like that, or pop-up toys, which are kind of where you press a button and something pops up. Those kind of what I would call cause and effect, or toddler toys, which are really useful for utilizing for turn-taking routines. And once I've identified those resources, I know where my turn-taking opportunities are. And then I need to think about, if I put a little shot of turn-taking into my interactions using those resources, who really needs me to go back to one-to-one turn-taking? My turn, your turn, my turn, your turn. Or who would be ready to move a little bit further up the skills framework, where we take turns with a simple resource, but we do it within a very small group. And just because I'm saying it's a small group, I don't mean it's happening on the carpet. I don't mean it's formal. Of course, it's a tiny bit adult-led because you're creating the specific opportunity just for a couple of minutes before you kind of then move on and use the learning environment in another way. But it's that idea about really, really kind of lifting that skill and targeting that skill specifically. And I think what's also useful is if I'm putting that shot of adult input, um, what's great is that that resource is then going to stay in the learning environment. So I'm going to be building skills with a resource that when I walk away to go do something else, that resource is still going to be there. So if we are using resources from the environment, and next time we're going to talk about focus groups, or if we're actually going to be building the skills within the environment, it's really useful to have things that the children are familiar with and that they then have access to independently and at other times, because then we're much more likely to see skills being transferred, and that generalization of learning. And I think that's quite important. So when we're doing turn taking, whether it's my turn, your turn, or whether we're doing turn taking in a small group. We're also going to be building a lot of vocabulary and understanding. So we'll be talking about turns, and it's your turn next, or it's my turn now. And what we can find is if we're building not just the skill of turn taking, but the understanding of the language around turn taking, is that when we've then got children in play situations, outside of that shot of turn taking work, it's really useful to still talk about turns. So again, we can sometimes talk quite a lot about sharing, but if we've been building that understanding of turns and that language of turns, that we can use that same terminology in play. So I'm not saying don't talk to the children about the need to share, but if we take it back and actually talk about whose turn, and it's your turn in a minute, or such and such needs a turn, then the children will find that easier to understand. And the good thing about using the terminology of turns is if you've been working on turn taking, children will begin to understand that a turn is something that you have, and a turn is something that you give away, but a turn is also something that you get back again. And I think sometimes when we talk about a more abstract concept of sharing, we understand what sharing is, but for a lot of children, particularly with language delay, the concept of sharing is quite high level and quite abstract. And I think a lot of children interpret it as, if I give this brick or if I give this car over to another person because I am sharing, I may never get it back. Whereas if we talk about turns and that child has been working on taking turns in a much more simplistic way, it doesn't become easy for them all of the time, but it becomes a little bit more understandable for them. And that this idea is the car isn't being taken away from you forever. It's a turn, and remember, we get our turns back. And working on turns and then trying to transfer that kind of understanding of turn taking into play can really support peer interactions and moving children towards playing in a parallel and eventually in a collaborative manner with their peers. So we're going to talk about some specific kind of skills in this session, and don't worry, I'm going to make sure I leave some time at the end for questions and for clarification. But I just kind of want to talk about books and kind of mark making kind of in isolation before I then kind of go into working on specific skills. Because really when we use books, we are using a resource that will allow us to build a whole host of skills all the way across the Launchpad skills framework, so that we can see Launchpad in two ways. We can see, if we build skills on Launchpad, then children are going to have more ability to understand stories, kind of demonstrate a love of reading, and have an interest in books and to have book skills. But in the same way, we can use books to also build skills on Launchpad. And so it's kind of quite important to kind of see that correlation, and that Launchpad is never isolated from any aspect of our practice, because anything that we do to build children's skills is building their skills on Launchpad. And like I said before, one of the we can build skills specifically through books. But what we have to do in particular is think about those children where we might need to backtrack and where we might need to be a little bit more inclusive in our approach to how we use books. So we talked about skill development. I mean, really the range of skills that I that you build when you share books with children is there's loads, and I wrote down just a few here, and to be honest, I stopped writing them down because I was running out of room. There are more than this. But of course, we develop children's auditory or listening skills when we share books together. We develop their receptive language, their ability to understand and process language. Of course, we build vocabulary. It creates expressive language opportunities because they're modeling what they hear, and we can give them repetitive ability to hear certain language structures. It's something that we do together, so they develop pragmatic and social communication skills. As children get a little bit older, then they will learn to listen and to understand books within groups, which is a really demanding but an important skill, which is in pragmatics. And by looking at pictures and then later on text in books, of course, we develop children's visual skills. And as we hold books and turn pages, and if books have got any movable parts, then of course we're using fine motor skills as well, to name but a few. And I've tried to colour code it as much as PowerPoint will allow in order to correlate those colours with those on the Launchpad skills framework. And what's interesting as well, and I should have said before I kind of moved on to the next one, is that gaps with any of those skills can affect children's ability to access stories, access books, and to demonstrate an interest in books. So again, if you've got children who find it difficult to listen to stories, who are not showing a natural interest in books, what are the skill gaps for that child that is causing a barrier to that? And so it again, it's like moving away from just thinking, oh, they're not interested. It's like actually their skill gaps are preventing them from being interested and demonstrating those book skills and that love of books. And certainly for those of you who are in schools, there is that kind of big push to demonstrate a love of reading. And what I would say is, with this inclusive approach in the early years, it's like we have to be able to articulate how are we demonstrating a love of reading for all of our children, not just our children who have got strong skills and strong language, and not just for those children who like books already. So when I'm thinking about inclusivity, again, it depends on the age children I'm working with. So for some of these books that I'm saying here, or about to say here, if you're working with younger children, these might be available for everybody. So if we're thinking about inclusive books, have I got any card books available so that the pages are easier to turn, so that if children have got fine motor skill levels lower down on Launchpad, then it's easier to turn the pages. Have I got books with hardbacks? Whereas actually, if we look into 3 to 4 year old provision, we can quite quickly see quite a lot of books with only paper pages and those laminated kind of quite floppy covers, and for children with fine motor skill gaps, that they can be quite difficult to hold and quite difficult to turn pages with. So again, if I've got that provision for 3 to 4 year children, of course I've got to have those, but do I have some of these card books and simpler books for holding and turning available? And in particular for children who find it more difficult to listen to and engage with books and stories, and certainly for children who really, really struggle to listen to stories in groups, do I have books with flaps? Do I have books with movable parts? Do I have multi-sensory books, so books with different textures, books with different sheens? And the ones that I always think about when I say that are those Osborne, That's Not My Car, or That's Not My Dolly type books, where the books are a book, but they're kind of half a resource. And books with flaps and multi-sensory books are really useful when I need to go back and say, right, my next step is to try and have an interaction with this child around a book. Listening to a story, understanding a story, and asking questions about a story will come much later. My next step is to actually have an interaction around a book where, yes, I'm adding language, but the book has um, that ability to move bits, lift the flaps up. We could play peekaboo with those flaps, or there are different bits to touch and to feel, so that there is more to kind of hold that child's attention, not just their listening and their language skills, but I can kind of then begin to build those listening and language skills through the fact that I've managed to hook them in with these earlier, more multisensory books, which are half book, half resource. And I think I've already said it, but when we're thinking about book skills and language skills breed an interest in books. And if we have already gone down that path where most of the time we share stories with children in a group, if I've got children who are really struggling to access books and stories in that way, how at other times am I going to go back to build those book skills, to build that interest, and to build the listening and the language skills, and the reasons why that child is struggling to listen to stories within a group. And that's particularly important, that where I need to go back, I need to create opportunities where the child can share books with me in different ways, not just within groups. And I think the same thing or the same principles apply for my thoughts about mark making. And again, this is kind of plotted out um, more in the kind of the symbolic skill strand of Launchpad, where, a child will begin to make exploratory marks, but then they begin to add meaning to those marks. And again, we talk about adding meaning after they've made the mark, and then um, actually then beginning to kind of think, oh, I'm going to draw such and such. So they add meaning before they make the marks. And from that meaning and mark making coming together, this is where we see the development of drawing, which obviously is massively affected by fine motor skills as well. But that drawing isn't just about fine motor, it's about the language process of drawing. And also it involves visual skills as well, because what the child is trying to do is picture what they want to draw, generating that idea, and then making marks to try and manifest that idea with the paint, or with the pencils, or with the chalk. And from all of this development is we get that kind of nurturing of true creativity. And creativity needs those visual and those fine motor skills to deliver it. But creativity is ultimately a language based process. So we can see how all that language processing really affects creativity, but also imagination as well. So, of course, when we're thinking about needing to unpick certain children and our practice with mark making, we need to make sure that we've got inclusive tools, so that we've still got things where children are much younger, or older children have got earlier grips. We've still got things that can be held in palms, or kind of chunkier things that can be held with the fist. But obviously, as well, as we work with older children, have that ability to kind of have more conventional mark making tools alongside, as children do move towards a cluster and then a more conventional grip. And again, the adult role is that modelling of mark making, and then beginning to model drawing. And it's a little bit like I said with play, that for some children you might actually need to teach drawing. If a child doesn't tend to gravitate towards mark making resources, or they do go to them, but they're stuck in that kind of exploratory mark making loop, they haven't moved into drawing. It could be that they don't actually understand what the process of drawing involves. And also, some children stay away from those mark making and drawing opportunities because of their fine motor skill level. But for children with language issues, it might be that they just don't understand that these marks that I'm putting onto paper can actually represent something in the real world. And teaching drawing is about me modeling myself making simple drawings and naming them and adding language around them. But of course, as well, we can teach drawing as we draw together. So I might draw a circle and call it a face, and put some eyes on, and then invite a child to add the nose on. Or I might draw an outline of a car and invite the child to put the wheels on. Oh, we've drawn a car. There's a car. And again, it's that realization that yes, resources in the environment, so that little lump of plastic with wheels on is not a real car. It's a representation of a real car in miniature form that I can brum, 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 and I can play with. But again, as I make marks on paper in the same way, but a different way, I can symbolize a car with the paint, with the chalks, with the pencils or the crayons. And again, I think for a lot of young children, they might have those experiences at home when they're young and as people draw together. But remember, not all children have those very early shared drawing experiences where they learn how to draw together. And it's a really important that we go back and create those opportunities for certain children. And again, if a child is not going to certain places, be it the book area, be it mark making, it's an opportunity for you to say, why? I need to look at that child more closely and think, why are they not? And what can I do about that? So let's kind of think a little bit more about moving specific skills. So I'm going to kind of talk, and we might not necessarily flow from left to right across Launchpad here, because I'll try and kind of link practice together. But to begin with, we will go to the left of Launchpad, to that first red column of Launchpad, which is auditory attention, which is the most fundamental of our listening skills. And I think as we move up Launchpad, we can see that it's all about a child moving from child-led listening to adult-led listening, beginning to work towards being able to listen in small groups, listening with hands-on resources, and then being able to listen just when it's a language and a listening based task. So that's kind of all plotted out. But what underpins the child's progression up that skill strand is their increasing ability to filter out distractions, to filter out background noise, to filter out other things that I could look at instead of the person who's talking to me. The ability to filter out other things that I could be doing instead of listening to you, but to filter them out so that I can home in on what I am listening to. And of course, that could be an environmental sound, but it could be somebody giving me an instruction. It could be somebody reading me a story. It could be just somebody as we're interacting and having a little chat together. And so I think within your learning environment, we've got to acknowledge that early years environments are some of the busiest places that you can ever possibly imagine. But we have to also understand that if we have too many distractions, that will be detrimental to children's auditory attention levels, and that for some children, those distractions will be more disruptive than others. So when you look at pictures in early years magazines, or when people are giving you an advice about your learning environment, about kind of, being a bit more minimal, kind of not all flashing lights and bright colours, that kind of idea about making the learning environment more simple and more neutral is about supporting the development of attention and supporting the development of play, because at the end of the day, early years environments are busy enough that those distractions can kind of make it very difficult for certain children to focus. And certainly if you are beginning, and we'll talk about this a little bit more next time, if you are beginning to bring your children together into groups to do some small group focus work, we have to be aware of that, of the distractions in that space and place where you tend to take the children, and could we minimize the distractions within that area to support the children's ability to focus on us. So let's think kind of more about more little things that we can embed into our learning environment. And we've already said about that kind of notion of having turn taking at the core of our practice. Working on turn taking, yes, it supports those peer interactions, but working on turn taking is also one of the best things that we can do to lift children up that auditory attention skills strand, even though on Launchpad it's plotted out in pragmatics. So of course Launchpad is kind of all into different columns, and things are plotted out and pulled apart and into that grid format. But we can also see that working on one skill will also have a positive knock-on effect on other skills. And in reality, skills don't function in isolation. And when you're concentrating and building one skill, you're always going to be building more than one skill at a time through your practice. Anyway, another kind of useful thing to embed, not maybe as much as turn taking, but is to create opportunities where you can play ready, steady, go with children. And this is kind of using your learning environment and your interactions to drop in a very specific opportunity to build auditory attention skills. So again, a lot of the resources that you could use for turn taking would also lend themselves well to ready, steady, go. But again, you're looking for things where is the child going to do something, but I can just drop in an opportunity where before they're able to do it, they've got to wait for me to say go. So again, I could use my car with the ramp. Again, I could use my cut off bits of drain pipe outside. I could use my slide to sometimes play ready, steady, go. But before they go down the slide, they've got to wait for me to say go. And it's really about kind of saying, we're not going to do this every day. We're not going to do this all the time. But sometimes this is a game that I'm going to play in my learning environment to create specific opportunities to build certain skills. With young children, I might play it with everybody, but as children get older, I might particularly play it with certain children more than others. And within it, I have the flex to differentiate it. So let's take the slide as an example. When the children are sitting at the top of the slide, for some children, it might be that I gently need to just put my hand on the child's leg and say, ready, steady, go, really quickly before I remove my hand. Showing them this notion of waiting and listening, but really I'm supporting them to wait and listen. And I am saying it so quickly that they don't have to wait and listen for very long anyway. And then the next level would be where I say, ready, steady, go, really quickly, but this time I'm not having to have my hand there as a physical prompt to remove after saying go. The child is just kind of going after I've said go, but I'm still getting there quite quickly. And then to stretch that skill. And again, at the same moment in time, you could play this at different levels, depending on who's sitting at the top of your slide. For some children, I would want to do ready, steady, go. And for other children, I would want to do ready, steady, go. So what I'm doing is saying, right, normally they would just climb up the slide and then go straight down the slide. But some days I'm going to create a deliberate opportunity to stretch that auditory attention by creating an additional opportunity where they've got to wait and listen when they wouldn't normally have to. And you know what? At the same time, they're going to think that that's great fun. And again, as children get a bit older and their skills progress, I can make it trickier by sometimes saying ready, steady, stop, ah ha ha, ready, steady, bananas. And obviously you have to get to ready, steady, go quite quickly. But there you're changing the word at the end and not just saying wait and listen, but wait and listen and then think about and process what I have said. Did I say go or did I say something else? And the top level that I've ever played this at would be where I deliberately changed the word at the end, but made it sound like go. So I might say ready, steady, bow, ready, steady, goat. And then obviously ready, steady, go. So they're not only are they having to wait and listen, not only are they having to listen to a different word and think, oh no, she didn't say go, but the reason that that's harder is because the word at the end sounds like go. So they're having to use a higher level of auditory discrimination and phonological awareness skills to work out that I haven't said go. And what's interesting is when you work at these different levels, sometimes you get children who can do it, but as soon as you move up to the next level, so if you start to change the word at the end, they just go down the slide regardless of the word that you've said, and you think, right, okay, we need to put a bit of input in here. And that is such a simple thing to add into your toolbox of strategies and your toolbox of ways of using your learning environment, that it's just such an easy win. And for me as a practitioner, that's what I want. I want lots of little things that I can just pull out in the moment, and to use throughout the day and to use in different ways for different children. So if we move back to the Launchpad Skills Framework and move a little way across, we've got auditory discrimination. So auditory attention is that ability to basically listen and listen in different ways, underpinned by this increasing ability to filter out distractions. And auditory discrimination is underpinned by auditory attention. So what we've always got when skills go together on Launchpad is this notion of left to right, so that gaps with skills on the left will affect the development of skills on the right. But auditory discrimination is a really important skill as well, because it's where children learn to process what they've heard and to identify what they've heard. And for those of you who are working in schools, or even for those of you who are working with 3 to 4 year olds, where you're thinking about getting them ready for literacy and getting them ready for phonics, in this skill strand, we plot out from early development how we get children ready in a really incremental and specific way to begin to hear sounds in words. But of course, auditory discrimination does not begin with hearing sounds in words. It begins much earlier than that. And one of the ways that we can build early auditory discrimination skills in a really simple way, and I talk a lot more about the detail of auditory discrimination in some of the phonological preparation CPD that comes as part of the toolkit. So again, that might be a place for you to go if you want to look into this a little bit more. But one of the things that I mentioned there, which we'll also mention today, is this notion of doing another audit, but this time it's an auditory audit. So basically, what have I got in my learning environment that when we use it or when we explore it, it makes a noise? And of course, some of those things will be loud, obvious things like my musical instruments, but it might also be things that make more incidental, less obvious noises. Like I might have popoids that when you make them shorter and longer, they make a lovely noise. Or it might be that I've got a basket of shells in my sand area, but when you rummage in that basket, the shells make a really quiet but lovely clinking sound. And the reason that I want to do that auditory audit, and not just to do it myself, but to do it with my team or to do it myself and share it with my team, is that I want my whole team, not just me, because it's not just me interacting with the child. I want my child to be aware where all the different opportunities are, where sometimes we could say, oh, listen, listen. And of course, I'm not saying every time you access those shells or every time you play with the popoids, all you're going to talk about is listening. Sometimes you'll talk about other things, but that because those resources have been highlighted as creating auditory opportunities, it makes it more likely that sometimes those opportunities will be utilised more than others. And again, if you've got slightly older children, but you've got certain children where you need to go back and build auditory skills at a simpler level, your learning environment creates lots of lovely opportunities to go back with that child or to go back with those children when actually what you're doing with most of the class has moved on to a much higher level, but these children still need to go back. And again, auditory discrimination is a skill I can work on in small groups, and we'll talk about kind of activities next time. But what I don't want to be doing is always thinking about interventions being an adult-led activity that has to happen on the carpet. So as well as that kind of creating more opportunities to listen by carrying out that auditory audit, what you're also doing is you're creating more opportunities to build the vocabulary around listening, so that what the verb to listen is, and you know, sound and noise, so that we're using that vocabulary as we're exploring our learning environment. And I'm not falling into the trap of only talking about listening when I'm trying to get the children to listen to a story or when they're sitting in the on the carpet, that listening is just something that we do as we explore our world together. And as well as building that vocabulary of listen, noise, sound, I can build concept vocabulary around sounds. And that's really important. So yes, I'm building auditory discrimination, but I'm building vocabulary, which on Launchpad is plotted out elsewhere. And when we're listening to things in our environment, there are certain concepts that kind of are particularly easy to focus on. This idea that things sound the same, and that later on we can talk about how things sound different and how things sound nearly the same, that things can be loud or things can be quiet. You know, a car can be loud, or a musical instrument can be loud, or this one can be quiet, but also I can bang loudly. Or I can, so again, it's that idea of loud and quiet are concepts, but depending on whether they're using, whether I'm using them to describe something or to describe what I'm doing, depends on whether I'm going to say loud or loudly. And again, it's just important that, you know, I don't tie myself up in knots with this, but that I am using these concepts in different ways as I talk about the world, and that we can make something be louder or quieter, or this one's quieter than that one, so that I'm also beginning to understand those concepts as I compare things to each other. And I haven't put it here, but obviously as well, that this is the loudest or this is the quietest, so that concepts describe, but they also describe things and they describe actions, and they can compare things together as well. And so that's why it's important that I build concepts, but that I build them in lots of ways so children get that breadth of understanding. We can talk about when I'm making sounds, whether I'm making a fast sound or a slow sound, and whether sounds are long or whether sounds are short. I think in early years we tend to do a lot on long and short, but we tend to focus on long and short about things that I can see. Long hair, short hair, a long train, a short train, a long ribbon, a short ribbon, which is all really good stuff. But again, things that I can hear can be long or short as well. And when I'm thinking about my very specific auditory resources, which could be some of my sensory resources, my musical instruments, for example, a lot of kind of sensory resources are multi-sensory, so that when I shake something, it makes a noise, but also little bits of glitter will float around. And in my mind, I've got sort of these balls that we used to have that created visual and auditory stimulation. But I think it's important that you have some resources where when you use them, the main thing it does is make a noise. So again, in my last learning environment, we had different rainmakers. So we had a rainmaker where when you tipped it up, a multitude of coloured beads used to fall down the rainmaker. And then we had some more traditional rainmakers, which were solid wood, where it did the same thing, but what was happening inside was hidden. So when I turned it upside down, yes, I got the visual stimulation of turning it upside down, but the main thing I could do is hear it rather than see it and hear it. Or we used to have some opaque little shakers that were filled with different things. And again, when you shook them, you couldn't see what was making the sound. They weren't clear, they were opaque. So I don't, again, want you to kind of get bogged down by this, but what will happen is some children who are stronger with visual skills and who struggle with listening skills, when faced with the rainmaker with the multicolored beads, they will use it, but they will primarily watch it. Whereas if I balance that out and have some resources where they mainly just create auditory stimulation, it's going to push those children who would normally watch rather than listening into listening a little bit more. So it's all about kind of balance. And certainly when we talk about activities next time, we'll talk about the kind of the role that visual skills play when we're specifically targeting auditory skills, but we'll come back to that next time. And when I think about those listening resources, remember, I can create, and again, we'll talk about this next time, but within my group activities, but also within my learning environment, I can create opportunities to build auditory discrimination skills. We can build auditory memory skills. I can use them to copy rhythms. I can use them to shake out or bang out words as we develop syllable skills, which is obviously in phonological awareness on Launchpad. And as we shake or bang, and as we name them and talk about what they sound like, then of course we've got that ever-present skill that we're building, which is that systematic building of vocabulary skills. But back more to kind of our more general use of the learning environment. And I think it's really important as we model play together, particularly as we model small world play, or particularly as we're modeling pretend play, is that we remember to use symbolic noises in our play. And symbolic noises is the kind of the posh word for saying brum brum or quack quack or different animal sounds. Or say, for example, when we were playing outside and we had little kind of vehicles, and we used to sometimes use the skipping ropes to pretend to be putting petrol in. And I always used to say shh as I was putting the petrol in the car, and I distinctly remember one little boy looking at me as if I'd gone mad and saying, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, well, I'm putting petrol in the car." And he's like, "Oh, right." Because again, what we want is we want children to imagine, we want children to pretend. And yes, of course, that's about what they're doing and what they're using and how they're using the resources that we make available. But remember, as we use those resources, by adding the noise, by adding the animal sound, or by adding a transport sound as we're playing with transport, or as we're adding the sound of the petrol gushing into the car, you know, that is a really important part of play, and it's crucial for children's language development, and it's crucial for developing very early vocabulary. And for a lot of our children who are not yet using words, either because they're still very young, or because they're still at pre-verbal levels of development, then symbolic noises can play a particularly important role. And it might just be me getting old, but I just think children have less experience of that. I think they have toys that now have, even simple toys, have batteries where it will make the noise for you. So I've got a fire engine that makes its own noise. I don't need to make the noise. So we've got that kind of use of technology in play that takes that need to add the noise and pretend away ourselves. But I also think that because children are used to much more visual in their world, you know, watching things on telly, watching things on iPad, the idea of pretending and adding a noise is possibly just something that they may be experiencing less. And I think that that's a massive shame, because it's really important for child development. So if we can become aware of that when they are with us in the setting, it's even more important that we specifically do that with them. And of course, symbolic noises are noises. They're halfway between kind of like a noise and a word, because they have a specific purpose and a specific meaning. Um, but as we kind of children develop language as well, we move on. And another important kind of thing that we're wanting to model, but when we see, is that we give puppets and characters a voice. That's particularly important for our small world and our role play. And that's important for language, and it's important for imagination. But giving characters a voice is also really important for the development of empathy. So on Launchpad, we talk about this in kind of that projection relationship and empathy, because when I am pretending to be a character, when I'm playing in the home corner, when I'm pretending to be big sister, or when I'm pretending to be somebody when I'm dressing up, or when I'm utilizing small world characters or playing with the doll's house, but I am speaking for the little boy or whoever, then what I am doing is I am putting myself in that character's shoes, but doing it through the vehicle of play. But being able to put myself into somebody else's shoes will later on allow me to put myself into another person's shoes, my friend's shoes, and then to think about what they like, what they don't like, how they feel, what, understand what. So again, this is going back, but it's a really important foundation skill that will be an important part of play. But on this scale, so much really of, so much that's really important is built on that scale. And so to nurture that and model that and be systematic in wanting to see that being developed and being used by our children has implications for children long beyond the early years. So kind of linking into this, because that's linked to vocabulary. And so when we're talking through these things, I'm not expecting you to go away and implement all of these things at once. This is a CPD where you might think, right, we're going to take the turn-taking message and we're going to put that in place first. And then when we feel like we've got that so that it's just happening and we don't really need to think about it too much anymore, let's lift another message from this CPD and let's put that in place. And the messages you lift and the ones you put in place will depend on you, your setting, and what the priorities are for your children, how old they are, and the needs that they have. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to go through quite a lot of different things you could do, and maybe over time you will begin to do these all of these, should I say, but that you take it chunks at a time. Or it might be that as I'm going through these things, you think, oh, well, we do that already. So actually, we don't really need to think about implementing that because our practice includes that already. We might need to think about going back a bit for some children, but it's not a big thing because we do a lot of that already. So that's the way that I see it. And another thing that you might want to kind of think about implementing, and we mentioned it in the session on interactions last time, was the importance of verb vocabulary, the importance of those doing words that allow us to talk about what is happening or to describe what I am doing or what a child is doing, or to describe what's happening in a picture. That those doing words are really important part of language development, and by having a stronger focus on verbs in your learning environment will be a simple shift. And it's not really you'll be doing it anyway, you might just put a bit more focus on, but it can have a really big impact on children's language skills. And if you were going to take this as something to move forwards with, what I would probably do is I would take one area of your provision at a time and say, right, okay, let's take the home corner to begin with, or let's take the Play-Doh. And with that area that you've chosen, that's up to you, that's not up to me. Let's together as a team, or even if I do the thinking, I've still got to discuss it with my team. But it's better if you can to try and do it together so that more people are on board and involved. Let's think about the doing words. Let's think about the verbs that this area creates opportunities for. So we've got Play-Doh, we've got pressing, we've got poking, we've got rolling, we've got pulling, we've got twisting, we've got cutting. There are more than that. Your home corner will create different verb opportunities. But what this process does, and again, it's too much to say, let's look at the whole environment, but taking it one area at a time gives you a really kind of focused opportunity to think about what those opportunities are. And then when you are in that area with those children, you are more likely to add a higher level of verb vocabulary than you would have done before. Don't get me wrong, you would have used verbs before, but you might begin to add verbs in a much more targeted and focused manner. And when that becomes automatic, you think, right, okay, let's do that again, but let's unpick this area. And it might be that by the time you've done 2 or 3 areas, You don't have to do the same unpicking with all areas. You might want to and need to, but it might be that just, oh, actually, this has just become much more automatic for me and my team now. And when we're using verbs with very young children, we want to be using them in the moment. And when we're using them in the moment, so if we're at the Play-Doh and we're cutting, then I'm saying we're cutting, you're cutting, I'm cutting, he's cutting. So that it's in what we would call the present tense. It's in the here and now. But certainly beyond those children at very early levels of language, I want to still be using language in the moment, but still be saying, oh, I'm going to cut out a dog or whatever. So I'm going to cut, I'm cutting, and then I cut out a dog. Or if we were utilizing, if we utilize it in the block area, for example, it's I'm going to build a tower, we're building a tower, and then we built a tower. So that I am still using verbs in the moment, but I'm also modeling how they can be used to talk about what we're going to do, the future, what we are doing, the present, and straight afterwards, what we did, which is where I use the verb in the past tense, so that children can begin to understand that verb when it's used in different ways, in different sentences by people, but they understand that all of those different slight changes around the verb still means the same thing. And it's important that we do that as well to help children also understand verbs in stories, because a lot of stories are about verbs, because stories are actually a sequence of different things that happened. So yes, they've got nouns in them, the names of things, the names of characters. Yes, they've got describing words. But ultimately, a story is a sequence of events, a sequence of activities. So verbs are really important. But what's quite important is that verbs, when they are used in stories, are usually in the past tense. So if we're thinking about room on the broom, for want of a better example, and away the witch flew, that flew is the past tense of the verb to fly. So not only is the child having to understand what the verb to fly is, but that they have to understand that the word flew is fly, but when it's after the event. So again, building that wider breadth of verb understanding in the learning environment will really help children when it comes to stories. But again, if you've got stories where you think, oh, what are the verbs in this story? And particularly if they're verbs that you think some of your children might not know, might not be as familiar with, right, where are my opportunities in the learning environment for me to use this verb alongside play? So when we've got the transport, I could be getting the aeroplane and it could be flying, and then I could put it down and I say, oh, the aeroplane flew all the way over there. So that again, the children are experiencing these words in stories, but they're also experiences these words out of stories as well. And again, that's something that you might want to look at and think about now, or it might be something that you might want to come back to in the future, or it might be something that you're not going to focus on at all because your priorities are with other things for your children. Right. Another thing to think about is the skill area of receptive language, which is the orange area of Launchpad, how children actually process what we say. And the targeted ways to use the learning environment that I'm going to focus on here are going to be primarily for auditory memory for understanding, which is that ability for children to hold a gradually increasing number of words in their auditory memory. And this is a fundamentally important skill. And it's quite easy for me to use my learning environment in a targeted way. If I use Launchpad to kind of just think about this skill a little bit more and to think about where my children are. But when I utilize my learning environment in a targeted way to try and lift children up this skill strand and to go back for some children and to work on their next steps and to remove that barrier that is there with their receptive language, the practicalities of it mean that I'm going to drop in little instructions as we share the learning environment and as we play together. And what I'm going to do when I drop in little instructions, I'm just going to drop them into play. I'm not going to turn this into an adult-led activity, is I'm going to make sure that when I do that, I use familiar vocabulary. So if I'm in the home corner with some children, and whether I'm going to be doing this with everybody or whether I'm just going to be particularly doing this a bit more with a target child, and there's some objects from the home corner on the table in front of us because we're sitting around the table, we might be having a cup of tea or whatever, then I might say to a child, oh, can you pass me a spoon and a plate? Or I might say, oh, can you pass me an apple and some bread? I wouldn't ask them together. It'd just be there are two examples. Both of those examples are of a 2-word level instruction where the apple and the bread or the spoon and the plate are there on the table. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask for 2 of those things. And I'm not going to point to the things that I'm asking for. I'm going to see if the child can find them just from listening to and understanding those words together in the one instruction. And if they find it tricky, of course, I'm going to jump in and I'm going to help them to, if they only can pass me one, so if they only pass me the spoon, I say, oh, thank you. Can you pass me a spoon and a plate? To help them learn how to understand it and follow them both. But to begin with, I don't point to the objects that match the words because I'm going to be giving them too much help. So that would be an example of what we would call understanding at 2-word level. But what's important is when I've chosen the words, it's about, well, what objects are here, but I'm also going to choose familiar vocabulary. I'm unlikely to drop in an instruction, which is to say, oh, could you pass me an aubergine and the colander? Because some of my children might know what those things are called, but a lot of my children won't. So when I'm dropping in these instructions, I want to try and make the vocabulary as familiar and simple as possible. Where Launchpad comes in and where Launchpad can really help if you're targeting this skill is to realize who understands what word level can they understand at, and what would be their next step. So that when I'm dropping in instructions, for some children, I'm just dropping in, I'm dropping in instructions that have just got one main word in. For other children, I'm dropping in 2-word level instructions. And then for some children, I'm dropping in longer 3-word level instructions so that I'm aware of what children can do, but I'm also aware of where I'm trying to lift them to next. And that's where Launchpad really helps you, but also to understand that this is a long-term process. This is not about saying, oh, next week I'm going to be able to go back and do that automatically. It's a process of upskilling, understanding your children, trying things out, and slowly upskilling yourselves as a team so that eventually these things to think about and these things to deliver and do just become automatic, but that it takes time and that it's a process and that's normal and that's right. But if we keep at it, and that's where we can really move things forwards for children. We can notice changes immediately, but we can really begin to notice systematic changes to our practice and to our children's progress over time. So if I work on auditory memory for understanding, and we'll talk about some activities for this next time, because that skill strand also lends itself quite well to little activities too. But we also have a positive knock-on effect on children's expressive language. If we boost language processing, we will boost expressive language output. If we boost language processing, it will also have a positive impact on children's general skills for learning. Levels of talk will increase generally. And of course, although we don't often think about it, this auditory memory for understanding is a crucial skill required for literacy readiness as well. And certainly for those of you working in schools, for your children in reception and Key Stage 1 who struggle with blending, it will be gaps with auditory memory for understanding, holding the right number of words, being able to hold words in the right order. That will be the real reason why those children can't blend. But again, there's other CPD in the toolkit that can help you to have a look at that. So within the learning environment, we've talked a lot about resources and areas, but I just wanted to kind of remind ourselves to think about the skill value of our daily routines, whether that be supporting children to get ready to go outside, be that kind of snack time, be that the washing of hands and the drying of hands. That these daily routines often, in different ways, because they're all slightly different, but they can create great opportunities for turn taking. We can focus on verb vocabulary, we can build vocabulary. So lots of the skills that we have already talked about as being important in our learning environment, our daily routines can be a really important layer of our working on skills and gap closing kind of agenda. And I think the other reason that daily routines are important is because they have that repetition, they have that routine to them. So when you play, although you might tend to do similar things in an area over time, play can change from one thing to another. Whereas at the end of the day, when we wash our hands and dry our hands, it's got that level of repetition, which is really nurturing and really useful for language development, so that they have the same routine, but then also to think about your language routines around those daily routines, and also having that kind of if on different days different members of staff take the children to wash their hands, that is there that benefit of having a familiar language routine around this daily routine, and that whoever is taking the children to do that might not say exactly the same, but they say similar things and model similar language structures. And certainly for children at earlier stages of language development, for children who are learning English as an additional language, who are new to English, this familiar repetition of language routines around the daily routine can be really, really valuable. And as those children make progress, you can keep your language routine, but you can just begin to add a slightly wider range of words, model slightly longer sentences. And again, remembering that importance of once they become familiar with language routines, then if we leave gaps and if we keep it familiar, we're more likely to see children have a go at joining in those language routines themselves, because it's predictable and they've internalized that a lot more quickly compared to if we said different things on different days, or if different people said different things in different ways. Again, just something to think about but I think that that's a really quite easy thing to implement, but that can have a lot of value for our most vulnerable children. Just kind of rounding off the learning environment, I know in the CPD we're particularly wanting to focus on speech, language and communication, but of course we will have children who we need to develop their skills, and they will also present with skill gaps with other aspects of Launchpad. And I just want to mainly also correlate your learning environment to those areas of Launchpad. So obviously, when we're thinking about visual skills, towards the top of Launchpad, we begin to talk about shapes and numbers and letters, but right down at the bottom in the early years, when we make children, when we make miniature objects available to children, through our small world, for example, then that is really important for the development of visual skills, where children realize that that chair in the doll's house is not a real chair, it's a representation of a real chair, but that they don't try to sit on it because they understand that it's a miniature chair, not a real chair. It's really important for visual development, but really important for cognitive development and non-verbal intelligence development as well. And again, we use pictures, and we primarily have pictures in books, but we will make picture material available to children, and just Launchpad can really help you understand that progression of picture material, so that we make sure that the pictures that we're using with children, and certainly next week when we talk about activities, mainly we're going to be using objects within those activities, but if you are going to be using pictures, that the pictures you're making available are able to be processed by the children, and that you're kind of also moving them through those stages of development. And again, whenever in our learning environment we create opportunities for children to sort and match things because of what they look like, whether that be by colour or whether that be, let's put all the people over here and all the animals over here, whether we're going to sort by shapes because I've got a little shape sorter. All of these things at different levels, depending on what the children are sorting and matching, will create opportunities to build visual skill. And in fine motor, which is at the very right of Launchpad, your learning environment will already be full of fine motor opportunities. But what we're looking for in your learning environment, and what we're looking for as we kind of go up the Launchpad skills framework, is the steady development and progression of different sub fine motor skills. And those will be hand-eye coordination, which is the most fundamental of fine motor skills. It will be the ability to have manipulative skills. And I want my children to be able to manipulate their digits, their fingers together, but also independently. You're probably beginning to see the emergence of arthritis on my fingers there, but never mind, that's another story. And also I'm wanting my children to develop finger and hand strength so that they can cope with fasteners, they can cope with taps, but they can also take the lids off boxes, and they can also kind of rake the leaves or dig outside because they're developing that finger and hand strength. And so really, when you're thinking about your learning environment, you'll have lots of fine motor opportunities there. But moving forwards, have you got opportunities that allow children to develop all of these things? And are you making sure that children are utilising those opportunities to develop these skills, and who actually need you to go back to develop these skills in more basic ways? And I suppose the other skill that kind of floats above those is we're working towards children learning how to have left to right tracking. So this isn't something that you teach in a week. It's not something that you teach with one resource, but as you're counting things, or as you're tracking text in books, or as you're searching for something on a shelf, as you're making and modeling drawing patterns with children, be it with big chalkboards, or be it just with, a pencil on a piece of paper. What you're instinctively doing as you count, as you make those patterns, as you look for something, as you count, what you're doing with all of those things is you're showing the children how, look at me, I'm going from left to right, so that just over time, children kind of learn to have that processing in their own way of processing the world, but they get it better and they get it quicker if we are more conscious of how we're modeling it ourselves. So I'm going to come out of this because we're going to, I would say ideally, end the recording when I come out of this, so that we can have some time for questions and clarification.
Yes, I'll end that recording now, Kirsty.
Thank you. Has it stopped sharing?
Yes, it has. And we've stopped